presenting history's best on PBS.
This documentary series has been made possible by grants from the following: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the annual financial support from viewers like you, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the Meadows Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Summerlee Foundation, and the following organizations and individuals.
In 1846, near a border traced by a river, two neighbors went to war. The fighting between the United States and Mexico began near the Rio Grande, then raged deep into the heart of the Mexican nation. From the shores of the Pacific to the Gulf Coast of Veracruz, to a final assault on the halls of Montezuma, Mexico City itself. In the end, Mexico was stripped of nearly half its territory. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. Land that transformed the United States into a continental power, reaching from sea to sea. This is the story of a war that reshaped a continent and forged a new identity for its peoples. A war that caused wounds that have yet to heal. The war between the United States and Mexico. The soldiers came from every region of their country, from Missouri, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Maine, from Chihuahua, Oaxaca, Guanajuato, and Veracruz. They met at Palo Alto, Cerro Gordo, Buena Vista, and on other faraway battlefields, where men with names like Holloway and Smith and Page, Flores, Cano, Rivera, fought each other and died. There were others who were not soldiers, ordinary people called upon to sacrifice everything to war. For Mexican and Indian families in the territories surrendered to the United States, there was a bitter consequence, even to peace. Many would be made to feel like foreigners in their native land. In the late summer of 1848, a group of 15 Mexican writers, intellectuals, soldiers, and politicians gathered near the fallen capital to write an account of the recent conquest of their country. One of the writers was a young journalist named Guillermo Prieto, destined to become one of his nation's most beloved poets. Prieto and the others called their work Apuntes, notes for the history of the war between Mexico and the United States.
For the first time, they came to measure their strength and to sustain the rights of their respective nations. These sons of two distinct races, now meeting to appear before a supreme being, destroying each other in the new continent as they had in the old.
They are a group of Mexicans who recognize that they have not done things well, but that the military defeat was not a moral defeat, that out of that experience would come lessons that would save the country, consolidate the country.
In the United States, soldiers, journalists, artists, and historians published their own accounts of the war with Mexico. Some saw the victory as proof that theirs was a model republic, favored by God. Yet others wondered if the conquered territory had come at the price of the nation's ideals. Thousands of returning soldiers, men like Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Ulysses S. Grant brought back experience that would serve them well against each other in the Civil War to come. But for now, it seemed that the war had forged a national identity, had revealed what one writer called the native germ of the American character.
America is the country of the future. It is a country of beginnings, of projects of vast designs and expectations. The bountiful continent is ours, state on state and territory on territory, to the waves of the Pacific Sea. One thing is plain. Here in America is the home of man. Ralph Waldo Emerson.
It was the beginning of a new era. The United States and Mexico would share a new border, would have to learn to live together as neighbors. The U.S.-Mexican War was a clash between neighbors who were strangers, two republics born into separate worlds. One was a brash, rapidly expanding nation of 20 million, driven by democratic principles and transformed by new technologies.
The United States was oftentimes referred to as a go-ahead nation, in quotation marks, a go-ahead people, with the locomotive almost as a symbol. This is all part of this boundlessness, all part of this idea of no limits on what people can achieve.
Meanwhile, Mexico's 7.5 million people were living a very different experience, rooted in Spanish and native traditions handed down for centuries. Mexico City, capital of New Spain for 300 years and of the Aztec Empire before that, had always been the cultural and political heart of the nation. Here, a university, printing houses, hospitals, and theaters had flourished before the Pilgrims landed on the shores of Massachusetts Bay.
The United States was born modern. They are already under the influence of the Industrial Revolution, of a capitalist system. When Mexico takes shape after the Spanish conquest and the blending with indigenous peoples, it inherits medieval European institutions, or almost medieval, and a deep history of native traditions. For the United States, to be modern is an act of natural evolution. For Mexico, to become modern means tearing down its institutions, destroying its social system, and changing its way of thinking.
From 1810 to 1821, Mexico fought a successful but devastating war for independence from Spain. Some hoped to establish a political system inspired by the U.S. model. But the early years of the new republic were chaotic. The government was constantly undermined by generals fighting for power. In the 27 years between the revolution and the end of the war with the United States, Mexico would undergo 22 changes of administration.
At its core, the country was experiencing a terrible crisis because it had lost its sense of leadership and political control, and this made Mexico extremely vulnerable.
Fanny Calderón de la Barca, the Scottish wife of the Spanish minister to Mexico in the 1840s, described a country bound by the legacy of Spanish colonialism.
Here, everything reminds us of the past, of the conquering Spanish who seemed to build for eternity, impressing each work with their solid, grave and religious character, of the triumphs of Catholicism. It is the present that seems like a dream, a pale reflection of the past. all is decaying and growing fainter, and men seem trusting to some unknown future which they will never see. One revolution follows another, yet the remedy is not found. Still they dream on.
One of Mexico's greatest resources was land, almost 1.5 million square miles. But the 10-year struggle for independence had devastated the nation's economy and decimated its population. Mexico was left unable to colonize its distant northern provinces. And the borderlands lay directly in the path of a growing United States. The United States had grown by purchasing land from other nations. But when the U.S. tried to buy Mexican territory, Mexico would not sell.
For them, it was a matter of national honor, not just pride, to maintain the integrity of all of the territory they had inherited from Spain.
Now Mexico worried that what the United States couldn't buy, it would take.
The haughtiness of these Republicans does not permit them to look on us as equals, but as inferiors. In my opinion, their conceit extends itself so far as to believe that their capital will be the capital of all the Americas. José Manuel Sosaya, first Mexican minister to the United States.
Two republics, bound by geography, yet separated by different histories and cultures. Few doubted that a showdown was approaching. In 1836, Mexico suffered a wound that it would blame on the United States. The blow was struck here, in Mexico's northern province of Tejas. In the Texas of 1821, only 2,500 Mexicans lived near a scattering of isolated missions and in a few small settlements. Tejanos lived deep in Indian territory, far from the protection of Mexico City. More colonists were needed. In 1823, the Mexican government made a fateful decision. It opened Texas to foreign settlers. The offer was cheap land and deferred taxes. Immigrants would become Mexican citizens. The plan worked, only too well. North Americans flooded across the border, bringing with them their own language and culture. When Mexico tried to close the border, the immigrants came anyway, illegally. Mexican residents in Texas soon found themselves outnumbered 10-1.
And since we did not have an army to guard the border, we know how difficult it is today to protect it, right? Even if you set up roadblocks or whatever, people can get through. Well, in those days, it was very easy.
For years, the colonists managed their own affairs. But in 1835, the Mexican Congress abolished most of the states' rights and centralized power in Mexico City. The move triggered a series of revolts in states across the country: Zacatecas, California, Yucatan, and Texas. On December 12, 1835, Sam Houston, commander-in-chief of the rebel Texas Army, issued a proclamation.
Citizens of Texas, you have realized the horrors of anarchy and the dictation of military rule. Your rights must be defended. The oppressors must be driven from our soil.
The rebellion in Texas infuriated Mexico's president, Antonio López de Santa Anna.
The foreigners who wage war against the Mexican nation have violated all laws and do not deserve any consideration. And for that reason, no quarter will be given them. In their audacity, they have declared a war of extermination against the Mexicans, and we should treat them in the same manner.
41 years old, General Santa Anna was a career military officer who had risen to the presidency through a shrewd combination of ambition, charisma, and guile. The general was fond of the dramatic gesture. He would take care of the rebellion in Texas himself. In February of 1836, Santa Anna and his army arrived in Texas. The first major battle was fought near San Antonio at an abandoned mission known as the Alamo. Against the advice of his own officers, Santa Anna ordered his troops to storm the compound. All of the defenders inside were killed. But the Mexicans suffered far too many casualties for a victory Santa Anna later said was but a small affair. 2 weeks later at Goliad, Mexican officers acting on Santa Anna's orders executed 340 Texas prisoners. The brutality of the campaign was meant to force the Texans into submission. Instead, Remember the Alamo and Goliad became battle cries of revenge. At San Jacinto, not far from the Texas coast, the afternoon of April 21st was warm and drowsy. Santa Anna was confident of victory. His troops were resting. Suddenly, Sam Houston's Texans charged the Mexican camp. The battle was over in 20 minutes, but the killing continued until the Texans had satisfied their vengeance. More than 600 Mexicans were killed. 700 were taken prisoner. Santa Anna tried to escape, but was captured and brought before Houston. He was dressed in the pants of a private, still wearing his silk shirt. It was a moment those who were there would never forget, the birth of the independent Republic of Texas. In Mexico, the loss unleashed a wave of anger against the United States. "We made a present of Texas to the Americans of the North," wrote a general named Jose Maria Tornel y Mendeville. "After we took them to our bosom, they destroyed us."
The loss of Texas would inevitably result in the loss of New Mexico and the Californias. Little by little, our territory will be absorbed until only an insignificant part is left to us. Our national existence, acquired at the cost of so much blood, would end like those weak meteors which, from time to time, shine fitfully in the firmament and disappear.
For Santa Anna, the loss of Texas would forever be a mark of humiliation and defeat.
Since I was not a tragic hero in my misfortune, I am branded a traitor. The distance between one and the other is immense.
Disgraced, Santa Anna returned to his estate in Mexico. 2 years later, he suffered another loss, a battle wound that led to the amputation of his left leg below the knee. The surgeon did a poor job, and Santa Anna would live the rest of his life in pain. But he used the incident to win back the hearts of his country's people. Once again, he became president of Mexico, only to be once again forced from office. As he sailed for exile in Havana that spring of 1845, even Santa Anna could not have predicted that he would return the following year to lead his country against the armed forces of the United States. On a rainy day in March 1845, United States President James Knox Polk stood on the steps of the Capitol in Washington. There, he delivered an inaugural address intended to be heard not only in his own country, but in the capitals of Mexico and Great Britain.
Since the Union was formed, the number of states has increased from 13 to 28. Foreign powers do not seem to appreciate the true character of our government. To enlarge its limits is to extend the dominions of peace over additional territories and increasing millions.
James K. Polk had entered the presidency with a solid reputation as a congressman and Speaker of the House. His wife Sarah had managed his early political campaigns and was well known in Washington circles for her intelligence and charm. By comparison, Polk was considered humorless and rigid, even by those who admired the discipline he brought to his job.
He had a very strong sense of duty and professional obligation, and a very, very strong work ethic. As he was fond of saying, I am the hardest working man in the United States, and few could really argue with him.
Each evening, Polk would meticulously chronicle the day's accomplishments in his diary. Here he complained that his days were filled with office seekers, visiting groups of school children, tourists staring at him as he ate. Only at night could he reflect on what he had come to the White House to achieve. Polk's goals were influenced by his mentor, Andrew Jackson, whose philosophy of westward expansion had inspired a new generation.
They believe that the government should open up these regions so that the resources there can be exploited, and anything that gets in the way of that exploitation should obviously be removed.
The expansionist vision would be condensed into one of the most powerful phrases in American history: manifest destiny.
It was a conviction that God had intended North America to be under the control of the Americans. It's a kind of early projection of Anglo-Saxon supremacy, and there is a racist element in it, but there is also an idealistic element.
To extend the boundaries of the United States was to extend the area of freedom. This was a common feeling. The model republic had certain obligations.
During his campaign, Polk had called for the annexation of Texas and the occupation of Oregon Territory. But on both issues, he faced the risk of war. Mexico had never recognized the independence of Texas. Great Britain claimed Oregon. But the first diplomatic crisis of the Polk administration would involve Mexico. In February of 1845, the U.S. Congress voted to annex Texas. For years, Mexico had warned the United States that to do so would be the equivalent of war. Mexican Ambassador Juan Almonte wrote to the U.S. Secretary of State calling the annexation of Texas an act of aggression.
Nowhere in the annals of modern history can one find a more unjust act: to rob a friendly nation like Mexico of so large a portion of her territory.
Almonte then demanded his passport, breaking diplomatic relations. The United States and Mexico were now one step closer to war. In July of 1845, President Polk ordered U.S. troops to the Texas coast. Their mission was to defend the border with Mexico. Texas had accepted the United States' offer of annexation, and Mexican troops were on the march north under orders to secure the border with the United States. In Mexico City, powerful voices were calling for war. Even so, the government of President General José Joaquín de Herrera hoped for a peaceful solution. Herrera had inherited a country left in shambles by Santa Anna, and the president was convinced that Mexico could not win a war with the United States. But with the nation in the grip of war fever, Herrera knew that his desire for peace could lead to his downfall. A scholar and politician, José Fernando Ramirez, saw the dilemma clearly.
The struggle will be lost by the first one to speak about peace. And for that reason, no one wants to express
the terrible word.
Quietly, Herrera looked for a way to preserve national honor without going to war. He let it be known that he would accept an envoy from the United States to discuss the Texas question. Polk responded quickly. His choice for the mission was John Slidell, a congressman from Louisiana who was fluent in Spanish. But now the president's objective extended beyond Texas to the Mexican territories of New Mexico and California. There were rumors that Britain also had its eye on California. Polk instructed Slidell to try and buy it first. Slidell was told to remind Mexico that it owed the United States more than $2 million. The claims would be forgiven if Mexico would sell its northern territories to the United States.
Mientras el gobierno mexicano piensa que el enviado
While the Mexican government thinks the representative, the special North American representative, is coming to renew relations and surely to pay or arrange for indemnification for the loss of Texas, for the North Americans, Texas is already a thing of the past, and the only thing that interests them is to buy territory.
The one way to provoke the Mexicans into resistance was the way that Polk had chosen, that is, to present a strong front and bluff the Mexicans into resisting or into yielding. In other words, negotiating with them at cannon's point.
Polk's instructions were leaked to the press, and Slidell arrived in Veracruz amid reports that Herrera was about to sell off the northern territories. The Mexican president was caught completely off guard. He tried to put off the meeting with Slidell, but it was too late. He and his cabinet were accused of treason. Desperately, Herrera tried to save his government and convince his country that there was no honor in fighting a war the nation could not sustain.
War with the United States over Texas is a bottomless abyss into which the Republic will sink, along with all her hopes for the future.
By now, few were listening. In San Luis Potosí, north of Mexico City, an ambitious general named Mariano Paredes watched as Herrera's government crumbled. Paredes was under orders to march north to the defense of the Texas border. Instead, he turned his army around, marched on Mexico City, and forced Herrera to resign. As the new president of Mexico, Mariano Paredes promised to lead his country into what he called a necessary and glorious war.
Corpus Christi, September 4th, 1845. Dear Sue, this is the dirtiest place I believe I was ever in. It is almost impossible to keep clean. I have got on a dark woolen purple shirt. It may smell a little after the second week, but the strong breeze carries off the odor. I have just been begging Crittenden to wash himself, but he appears, like all the rest, to have no regard for the nasal or optical organs of his fellow wallowers. Napoleon Dana.
He had been named for his father's heroes, but Lieutenant Napoleon Jackson Tecumseh Dana arrived in Texas determined to find glory on his own. Dana was one of 4,000 U.S. soldiers camped on the beach at Corpus Christi and along the banks of the Nueces River. The small force represented almost half of the entire Army of the United States. The soldiers were poorly paid. Nearly 50% of the enlisted men were recent immigrants.
No, that army was
was no powerhouse. A juggernaut was not the word for that army at that time. But they had good officers. West Point had begun to take hold. West Point was founded 43 years earlier. But it was not appreciated. It was always on the verge of being done away with. Our tradition has been always that fear of militarism, and therefore taking every measure possible to prevent the military from beginning to feel too important.
The troops were commanded by a 61-year-old general from Kentucky named Zachary Taylor. Raised on a frontier, Taylor was blunt and plain-spoken. The general disdained military pomp and ceremony and disregarded regulations concerning military dress. He favored straw hats, wore ragged pants, and dusty coats. One man said he looked more like an old farmer going to market with eggs. But Taylor had earned respect for the fearless way he had fought alongside his men 5 years earlier during the Seminole Indian War in Florida. To his soldiers, who admired both his courage and his homespun ways, he was known as Old Rough and Ready. Throughout the fall and winter of 1845, Taylor organized his army. There was plenty of time for young officers like Napoleon Dana and 23-year-old Ulysses S. Grant, only 2 years out of West Point, to train with the troops under their command.
Now, you would think that in a country of whom so many of the citizens were frontiersmen, that you would pull them together with their muskets and you'd have an army. But it so happens that the techniques you use for survival on the frontier include running away when the situation calls for it. Includes independence and self-reliance. Well, now, those are all fine virtues, but when you come to an army, you want people who do what you say, and also, if you tell them to hold a position at all costs, including their lives, they stay there, and they do. Now, that takes discipline. That takes a lot of work.
A West Point graduate named Samuel Ringgold used the time to relentlessly drill his light artillery units, a fast-moving force the soldiers called flying artillery. In battle, Taylor was known to favor his infantry, relying on the brutal efficiency of the bayonet. Major Ringgold was eager for the chance to prove the worth of his men, and Lieutenant Dana was tired of waiting.
Dear Sue, if Mexico declares war, I believe General Taylor means to march us right on to Matamoros. If he does, it is to be hoped that we will not get a whipping. What a military show we have here, and how much of the pomp of war and none of the glory. I wish I had all of my glory and was on my way home again. But let us hold on and see what Mr. Polk is going to do.
Dear Julia, everyone rejoices at the idea of leaving Corpus Christi. It is to be hoped that our troops being so close on the borders of Mexico will bring about a speedy settlement of the boundary question. I think the chances of a fight are about equal to the chances for peace. Ulysses Grant.
On the 8th of March, 1846, with the Dragoons and Major Ringgold's flying artillery leading the way, the U.S. Army crossed the Nueces River, heading south. With the failure of the Slidell mission, Polk had ordered Taylor to take a position on the Rio Grande, called the Rio Bravo by the Mexicans, opposite the town of Matamoros. The decision was certain to anger Mexico further. Mexico had claimed the Nueces River as its border with Texas, but Polk had adopted Texas' claim that the border was at the Rio Grande. When Taylor crossed the Nueces, he was crossing into disputed territory.
He was in territory that Mexico claimed legitimately as part of its own land. And if he went down as far as the Rio Bravo and crossed it, then he would be in territory that wasn't even in dispute. It was Mexican territory.
In late March, the first of Zachary Taylor's soldiers reached the north bank of the Rio Grande. Across the river in Matamoros, a crowd of Mexican soldiers and civilians watched as the U.S. troops rigged a flagpole and ran up the Stars and Stripes.
The soldiers of the Army of the North were angered by the enemy's insult. For the first time, that flag waved proudly before our forces, as if taking possession of what rightfully belonged to us. Jose Maria Iglesias.
The U.S. troops set to work building an earthen and wood fort they called Fort Texas. And for 3 weeks, tensions mounted as the U.S. and Mexican armies faced each other across the Rio Grande.
We are prepared for attack at any moment, often sleep in our clothes. Both sides appear to be always on the alert. We heard the Mexican horns and bugles across the river, blowing all night. Lieutenant Napoleon Dana.
As more Mexican troops gathered in Matamoros, some European observers predicted a quick Mexican victory. Mexico's regular army was 3 times as large as that of the United States. But the ranks were filled with inexperienced troops, peasants and Indians pressed into service through what were called quotas de sangre, quotas of blood. The army did have its elite, among them handsomely uniformed lancers whose skill on horseback was matched by their courage. But the army lacked a corps of well-trained officers, and Mexican military tactics had not changed since the days of the Spaniards. On April 24th, the stalemate on the Rio Grande was broken when fresh troops led by General Mariano Arista arrived in Matamoros. That same day, Arista sent 1,600 soldiers across the Rio Grande. At Rancho de Caracitos, about 20 miles from Fort Texas, the Mexican soldiers surprised a U.S. scouting party. Fuego! The attack killed 14 U.S. soldiers and wounded 7. The rest were taken prisoner. The skirmish at Rancho de Caracitos was over in minutes. But as far as Zachary Taylor was now concerned, the United States was at war. The general sent a dispatch to Army headquarters in Washington.
April 26, 1846. Hostilities may now be considered as commenced, and I have this day deemed it necessary to prosecute the war with energy and carry it, as it should be, into the enemy's country. General Zachary Taylor.
Taylor knew he was in a dangerous position. His supplies were on the coast at Point Isabel. The Army's survival depended on protecting them. The general set out for Point Isabel with 2,000 soldiers, leaving 500 troops to defend Fort Texas, with orders to fight to the last man. The Mexican artillery in Matamoros rained a continual barrage on Fort Texas. The shelling could be heard all the way to Point Isabel. Lieutenant Ulysses Grant remembered the dreadful sound.
As we lay upon the seashore, the artillery at the fort could be distinctly heard. The war had begun. What General Taylor's feelings were, I do not know, but for myself, a young second lieutenant who had never heard a hostile gun before, I felt sorry that I had enlisted.
Taylor's men quickly loaded their supplies into 200 wagons and began the march back to Fort Texas. On the afternoon of May 8th, they found General Arista's army waiting for them. A line of nearly 4,000 Mexican soldiers, infantry, cavalry, and artillery stretched a mile across a wide plain of tall, sharp grass and cactus. The Battle of Palo Alto began with the roar of cannon fire and quickly turned into an artillery duel. The soldiers of Major Ringgold's flying artillery used their skills to deadly effect. Advancing their batteries at full gallop, they could unlimber, fire, remount, and whirl off to a new position with astonishing speed. Time after time, Ringgold's units raked the Mexican lines, slashing their ranks with a rain of hot iron.
The American artillery ravaged the Mexican ranks horribly. The troops, frustrated by the needless deaths, cried out for permission to attack the enemy at bayonet's point and die as brave men should. Jose Maria Iglesias.
But Arista's officers ordered the Mexican troops to hold their position. This they did, at the cost of many lives. As Ringgold advanced yet again on the Mexican lines, a cannonball ripped through both his thighs. The wound was horrible, and the major lingered for 3 days before he died. When evening fell, the Mexican troops withdrew to reorganize, while the U.S. soldiers passed the night on the battlefield. The weary men slept through the groans and screams of the wounded from both sides. The surgeon saw, said one, was going the livelong night. During the night, General Arista had ordered his army to fall back to a new position at Resaca de la Palma, an old riverbed cutting across the road to Fort Texas. Arista had chosen well. A natural barrier of thick and thorny underbrush lined the riverbed. But encouraged by the previous day's success, Taylor ordered his men forward. Now, U.S. and Mexican soldiers met each other face to face. Overwhelmed, the inexperienced Mexican troops panicked and fled toward the Rio Grande, seeking safety on the other side.
The confusion was astonishing. Fright spread the idea that the enemy was following close behind. They threw themselves into the river, clothed and armed, and almost all were drowned.
The 2 days of fighting had cost Taylor's army almost 200 casualties. The Mexican losses were more than 3 times greater. U.S. troops captured General Arista's tent with all of his belongings, including valuable maps and a set of silver. As the soldiers celebrated their victory, Lieutenant Dana wrote to tell his wife of all that had happened.
You don't know, my darling Sue. The battle was a horrid spectacle. Corpses mangled most horribly. The wounded crying for assistance. A woman on the field of battle with a babe in her lap, unable to weep but wringing her hands and combing the hair of her mangled husband's corpse and kissing his bloody lips. All are sights unsuited to my tastes and shocking to my feelings. I do not think that our war will last much longer. The people of Mexico will not stand it.
On Saturday, May 9th, unaware of the fighting in Texas, President Polk and his cabinet discussed what steps to take next with Mexico.
All agreed that if the Mexican forces at Matamoros committed any act of hostility on General Taylor's forces, I should immediately send a message to Congress recommending an immediate declaration of war.
In fact, Polk had already started to draft a war message. The president was frustrated by the failure of the Slidell mission. He hoped a declaration of war would pressure Mexico into resolving the Texas border issue and selling its northern territories. At 6 o'clock that very evening, Polk received the news he needed to make his case to Congress. It was Taylor's report describing the Mexican attack on his scouting party at Rancho de Caracitos 2 weeks earlier. That night and all day Sunday, the president worked on completing his call to arms.
After repeated menaces, Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States and shed American blood upon the American soil. As war exists, notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, and exists by act of Mexico herself, we are called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate the honor, the rights, and the interest of our country.
Polk's war message was cheered by expansionists in Congress, attacked by a small but vocal opposition. Some charged that Polk had overstepped the authority of his office by starting a war without congressional approval. Others opposed the war because they opposed slavery. They feared that any land taken from Mexico would add more slave territory to the Union.
The arguments which Polk's Democrats used were, we must back up the troops. They have been attacked by Mexico, and we must send them supplies, and we must send them reinforcements. And if we do that, we might as well declare war.
In the end, Congress authorized $10 million and 50,000 volunteers. It was a small but historic appropriation. For the first time, tens of thousands of American soldiers would be sent to fight on foreign soil. Just as the U.S. Congress issued its call for volunteers, news of Taylor's victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma swept the nation. The war was the first in U.S. history to be covered by mass circulation newspapers. The Alamo, Goliad, and other stories from the Texas Revolution 10 years earlier had made a deep impression on people in the United States. Many were eager to join the fight.
The news was hailed with a great deal of excitement. It was just a wave of rejoicing and excitement, the news of these battles. Business was suspended, shops would close, people would be out in the streets celebrating. And of course, it had a direct impact on the recruiting of the volunteers, and the volunteers now flooded the recruiting offices in numbers that far exceeded the quotas.
In New York, Walt Whitman, poet and editor of the Brooklyn Eagle, fanned the flames of American patriotism with editorials bursting with passion and prejudice.
Let our arms now be carried with a spirit which shall teach the world that, while we are not forward for a quarrel, America knows how to crush as well as how to expand. What has miserable, inefficient Mexico, with her superstition, her burlesque upon freedom, her actual tyranny of the few over the many, what has she to do with the peopling of the New World, with a noble race? Be it ours to achieve that mission.
Dramatic images of the war spread to parlors and drawing rooms through inexpensive prints and sheet music.
Pianos were extremely popular during this period of time, and there was a flood of sheet music being issued, published with beautiful, embellished, and sometimes fantastic lithographs describing at least the perception of some of the battles.
Major Samuel Ringgold, the artillery officer killed at Palo Alto, became the first martyr of the war with Mexico.
And music, there was music written for him, the lament for Major Ringgold, and lithographs, a great many, not always agreeing on how he died. There was this thirst for heroes and this idea that the Mexican War opened up a new heroic age now that would help to strengthen and enhance the model republic in the eyes of the world. And Ringgold had the good fortune of being killed in the first battle.
Young men who had never experienced war imagined themselves carrying on the glorious tradition of the founding fathers of the republic. Some wore uniforms of their own devising. They brought their own horses and elected their own officers. Like many civic-minded men, 45-year-old Jefferson Peak of Warsaw, Kentucky, raised his own company of volunteers. Peak went to war, leaving behind a wife and 7 children to tend the family farm.
Dear children, you must all try to behave, and you must feed and salt the cow twice a day. And tell Sarah Ann to put out the sun every day for Ma's cherries and raspberries and take them in at night. Wallace and Jeff, my dear boys, see how well you can conduct yourselves. I remain your dear father until death. Jefferson Peak.
Jefferson Peak joined thousands of other volunteers who packed the riverboats that steamed down the Ohio and Mississippi, heading for Mexico and the halls of Montezuma. In Mexico City, the government reacted with anger and disbelief to President Polk's claim that Mexico had started the war.
Los mexicanos estaban defendiendo su casa.
The Mexicans were defending their home. The ones coming into the territory who were foreigners were the Americans.
México nunca declaró.
Mexico never declared war against the United States. The Mexican government issued a declaration of the need to defend its national territory. Not one member of the Mexican army was ever in North American territory. Not even in the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca. This was territory in dispute.
By the end of May 1846, Zachary Taylor's army had crossed the Rio Grande and occupied the city of Matamoros. There were those in the United States who were certain that the war would be over quickly. Mexico would prove them wrong. As Taylor waited for reinforcements, the Mexican government issued a call to arms.
One defeat does not decide the war. Mexico must fight to the end. And as long as there is one man remaining, he must go and fight the unjust invaders.
This documentary series has been made possible by grants from the following: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the annual financial support from viewers like you, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the Meadows Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Summerlee Foundation, and the following organizations and individuals.
This is History's Best on PBS.
I saw a Mexican female carrying water and food to the wounded men of both armies. I heard the crack of one or two guns. I turned my eyes to heaven and thought, oh God, and this is war.
Next time on the U.S.-Mexican War.